Welcome to our Wild West stories. Where are you watching from? Please subscribe and let's dive in. The sun beat down with an unforgiving fury on the Arizona Territory in August 1880, baking the earth into a cracked, thirsty canvas. Georgia lay sprawled amidst the brittle scrub brush, each breath a shallow, ragged gasp that scraped against her raw throat. The world around her was a dizzying blur of ochre and heat haze, punctuated by the persistent, mocking buzz of flies. A crimson stain bloomed on the tattered fabric of her dress, a testament to the brutal ambush that had torn her life apart mere hours ago. Her children, her precious little ones, were gone, ripped from her arms by the same faceless shadows that had left her for dead. The memory was a searing brand, hotter and more agonizing than the desert sun, fueling a desperate, flickering ember of defiance in her otherwise broken spirit. She pushed against the ground, a whimper escaping her lips, her gaze sweeping the horizon with a frantic, unseeing hope. There was nothing, only the vast, indifferent expanse of sand, rock, and sky, stretching out like an endless tomb. Just as the last vestiges of consciousness threatened to slip away, a faint tremor in the ground, almost imperceptible, registered deep within her. It grew, slowly but surely, evolving into the rhythmic thud of hooves. Georgia's eyes, heavy with impending darkness, struggled to focus. A silhouette, tall and imposing, appeared against the shimmering horizon, slowly taking the form of a man on horseback. He was a lone rider, emerging from the shimmering mirage like a phantom of hope or perhaps, another harbinger of doom. Fear warred with a desperate, primal instinct to survive. Could this be one of them, returning to finish the job? Or could this be salvation? Her vision blurred, the figure wavering in and out of focus, until finally, the overwhelming darkness claimed her, just as the horse's hooves scuffed to a halt mere feet away. The last thing she registered was a deep, concerned voice, speaking words she couldn't quite grasp, before the world dissolved into black. The desert wind, which had been a harsh whisper of death, seemed to hold its breath as Fletcher dismounted. He was a man etched by the landscape, lean, wiry, with a sun-weathered face and eyes the color of a fading denim shirt. He knelt beside the fallen woman, his movements a practiced economy of motion born from years on the trail. He saw the bullet wound, a puckered, angry red stain on her side, and a wave of grim familiarity washed over him. This wasn't a simple robbery, it was an execution. He checked her pulse, a faint but steady rhythm against his calloused fingertips. She was alive, but barely. His mind, usually a fortress of practicality, was momentarily flooded with the moral dilemma of the West. Ride on and mind your own business, or intervene and risk everything for a stranger. The image of his own sister, lost to the unforgiving wilderness years ago, flickered in his mind's eye. He couldn't leave her. With a practiced efficiency, Fletcher carefully lifted Georgia's limp body onto his saddle, securing her against him. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew the fundamentals of survival. The nearest settlement was a 2-day ride to the south, and he doubted she would last that long. His gaze swept the empty horizon, searching for any sign of a more immediate refuge, and his eyes landed on a faint, almost invisible trail leading east, towards the distant, jagged silhouette of the Dragoon Mountains. A place whispered about in saloons and campfires, a hidden canyon known only to a few. A place where a man could disappear. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was their only chance. Kicking his horse into a gentle canter, Fletcher turned away from the setting sun, carrying his fragile cargo into the unknown, a silent promise forming in the grim set of his jaw. He didn't know who she was or what had happened to her, but he knew he couldn't let her die. The journey was a slow, agonizing crawl against the relentless tide of heat and time. Georgia drifted in and out of a feverish haze, her consciousness a fragmented mosaic of pain, fear, and the phantom sensation of a rocking horse. She was vaguely aware of being held, of a strong arm supporting her, and the gentle, rhythmic motion of a horse's gait. The smell of dust and leather mingled with the coppery tang of her own blood. In one fleeting moment of clarity, she managed to murmur a single, desperate word. "Children!" she croaked, her voice a dry rasp. Fletcher's response was a low, steady rumble of reassurance, words she couldn't comprehend, but the tone was enough. It was a promise, a beacon of safety in the storm. As the second day bled into a star-spangled night, they finally reached the entrance to the hidden canyon. A narrow, almost invisible slit in the rock face opened up into a breathtaking secret world. A small, secluded spring trickled down mossy rocks, feeding a patch of vibrant green grass. Fletcher carefully dismounted, his legs stiff with exhaustion, and laid Georgia down on the soft ground. He fetched water in his canteen, dabbing it on her parched lips and feverish brow. He then cleaned her wound with what little alcohol he had, the woman's pained gasp a testament to her resilient will. The quiet of the canyon was a stark contrast to the unforgiving desert they had just traversed, a sanctuary where time seemed to slow. As Fletcher tended to her, a single, silver tear slipped from Georgia's closed eye, a silent thank you to the stranger who had given her a chance at life. The worst was over, for now. But as dawn approached, Fletcher couldn't shake the chilling feeling that this fragile peace was a fleeting illusion, and that the shadows who had pursued her would not stop until their job was finished. For the next few days, the canyon became their entire world. Fletcher hunted small game and gathered sparse herbs, while Georgia, her fever finally broken, began to regain her strength. She still spoke little, her voice a mere whisper, but her eyes, now clear and sharp, followed Fletcher's every move. She watched him with a mixture of suspicion, gratitude, and a profound, wordless sorrow. Finally, on the third day, she broke her silence. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Fletcher stopped his task of mending his saddle and looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Couldn't leave a person to die," he said simply, his tone devoid of any hint of heroism. "It's not right." It was a simple statement, yet it held the weight of a code of honor etched into the very fabric of the Wild West. Georgia then told him her story. Her name, the names of her children, Lily and Thomas, and the name of the man who had ordered their abduction, a ruthless land baron named Silas Blackwood, who was trying to force her husband to sell their ranch. She hadn't seen them for a week. Fletcher listened, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes betrayed a quiet fury. The story was as old as the territory itself, powerful men preying on the weak. When she finished, a fragile silence settled between them, broken only by the chirping of crickets. Fletcher looked at her, at the raw, unhealed grief in her eyes, and then he looked at the distant, hostile world beyond the canyon walls. He made a decision, a vow whispered to the desert wind. "We'll find 'em," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Your children. We'll get 'em back." It was a simple promise, but in that moment, it was as binding as a blood oath. Forging a new beginning from the ashes of her despair. The journey would be long and dangerous, and they were just two people against a powerful, ruthless enemy. But now, they weren't alone. The vow hung in the air between them, a heavy, tangible thing. For Fletcher, it was a profound departure from his solitary existence. His life had been one of simple truths, a good horse, a full canteen, and a vigilant eye on the horizon. Now, he carried the weight of another's grief and a dangerous quest that had nothing to do with him. He watched Georgia as she rose, a new resolve hardening the soft lines of her face. The hunted had become the hunter, and he was now her reluctant partner. He knew the name Silas Blackwood. The man's reputation was a poison on the wind, a ruthless land baron who had carved out a small empire with threats, violence, and blood. Taking him on was a fool's errand, a one-way ticket to an early grave, but looking at the fire in George's eyes, Fletcher knew there was no turning back. They spent the next day preparing for the journey. Fletcher fashioned a makeshift sling for George's arm, and together, they packed what little they had. He gave her a spare pistol, teaching her how to load and fire it with grim efficiency. She learned quickly, her hands trembling not from fear, but from a desperate eagerness to reclaim what had been stolen. As they rode out of the canyon, leaving their sanctuary behind, the midday sun felt less like a blessing and more like a spotlight, exposing them to the vast and dangerous world. They were two lone figures against an empire, a woman fueled by vengeance and a man bound by an unspoken code. They were heading east, towards the mining town of Salvation's Rest, the last place Georgia had seen her husband and children. It was a long shot, but it was their only lead. As they rode into the vast unknown, a silent understanding passed between them. They were not just on a journey, they were on a warpath. The road to Salvation's Rest was a dusty, unforgiving ribbon of hard-packed earth, lined with skeletal saguaros that stood like silent sentinels. They rode in a tense silence, the only sounds the creak of leather and the rhythmic thud of their horses' hooves. Georgia's mind was a whirlwind of memories and fears, each twist of the trail bringing her closer to the place where her life had been shattered. She remembered the ambush, the glint of steel, the cold, dead eyes of the men who had taken her children. Fletcher rode a few paces ahead, his form a silent, protective shield. His eyes constantly scanned the horizon, his hand never far from the butt of his pistol. He was a man of few words, but his presence was a reassurance, a quiet promise of safety in a world that had proven to be anything but. As dusk began to paint the sky in hues of orange and violet, Fletcher suddenly reined in his horse, holding up a hand to stop Georgia. He dismounted, kneeling to examine the ground. He pointed to a series of fresh tracks, too many for a simple party of travelers. He then pointed to another set, the impressions of a large, distinctive boot heel. A cold dread settled in Georgia's stomach. It was one of Blackwood's men. They were being followed. They had been since they left the canyon, and the pursuers were gaining on them. Fletcher looked at her, his expression grim. "They'll be on us by morning," he said, his voice low and serious. "We need to get off this trail and find cover." As the last light faded from the sky, they spurred their horses into the desolate wilderness, the sound of the approaching riders a silent, chilling promise of violence on the wind. The night was a suffocating blanket of darkness, broken only by the pale, indifferent light of a sliver moon. Fletcher and Georgia rode hard, their horses' hooves a soft patter on the sandy ground, heading for the shelter of a dry riverbed. The terrain was treacherous, and every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Georgia's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. The thought of her children was the only thing that kept her going, a burning light in the suffocating darkness. She glanced at Fletcher, a silent question in her eyes. He met her gaze, a man of unwavering resolve, and a sense of calm, however fragile, washed over her. He was a rock in the churning tide of her fear. As they reached the riverbed, Fletcher dismounted and pulled Georgia from her horse. "We'll set up here," he said, his voice a low whisper. He led the horses into a small, rocky grotto and began to cover their tracks, using a broken branch to sweep away the telltale imprints in the sand. He then returned to Georgia, his face a grim mask in the moonlight. "We'll wait here. They'll expect us to keep moving. When they ride past, we'll double back and get on the main road again." A cold knot of fear tightened in Georgia's stomach. They were trapped, forced to rely on a dangerous gamble. What if he was wrong? What if they were found? As the hours ticked by, the wind carried the faint sound of approaching riders. They were getting closer. The crunch of hooves on the dry riverbed, the quiet jingle of spurs, and the low murmur of voices. They were here. Fletcher pressed a finger to his lips, urging her to be silent. They held their breath, a silent prayer on their lips, as the shadowy figures rode past, their forms silhouetted against the night sky, their relentless pursuit a chilling reminder of the danger that followed them. They had escaped for now, but a single wrong move could spell their end. The night wore on, each moment stretching into an eternity of tense waiting. The sound of the riders faded into the distance, but the memory of their passing lingered, a cold, metallic taste in Georgia's mouth. She watched Fletcher, his eyes like two dark pools, scanning the horizon for any sign of a returning threat. He was a sentinel in the darkness, a figure of stoic resolve that somehow managed to calm the frantic beating of her heart. When he finally let out a long, slow breath, the sound was a palpable release of tension. "They're gone for now," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. "We'll wait until first light, then we'll move." They took turns keeping watch, the silence between them no longer a barrier but a shared understanding of their precarious situation. A profound gratitude welled up in Georgia, a powerful emotion that transcended words. He had saved her, and now he was risking his life for her and her children. As dawn's first light painted the sky a pale, hopeful gray, they mounted their horses and began to retrace their steps. The landscape, which had seemed so hostile under the cloak of night, was now bathed in a soft, ethereal glow. The air was cool and crisp, a welcome respite from the scorching heat of the day. They reached the main road just as the sun broke the horizon, a fiery orb of red and gold. Fletcher's eyes, however, were not on the beauty of the sunrise. They were fixed on a dark shape lying in the middle of the road. It was a horse, his own horse, the one he had ridden out of the canyon, now dead, a bullet hole in its flank. The sight was a chilling reminder of the ruthless men they were up against. They hadn't just been followed, they had been hunted. The men had been looking for Fletcher's distinctive stallion, and when they didn't find them on the trail, they had left a warning. A cold shiver ran down George's spine. The price of their escape had just gone up. They rode on, sharing the remaining horse, a quiet mare named Bella. Fletcher walked for long stretches, his gaze always on the horizon, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. The shared journey became a slow, deliberate rhythm of shared hardship and silent understanding. When they finally saw the dusty silhouette of Salvation's rest in the distance, a shiver of dread and anticipation ran through Georgia. This was it. The last place her family had been whole. The town was a miserable collection of ramshackle buildings, a testament to the fleeting nature of gold and the men who chased it. As they rode into the main street, the town's life seemed to come to a halt. Heads turned, eyes followed them, and the low murmur of conversation ceased. They were strangers in a town that had clearly seen too many of them. Fletcher led the horse to the livery, his posture alert, his senses on high alert. Georgia dismounted, her legs shaky, her eyes scanning the faces of the townsfolk. Every man was a potential enemy, every shadow a hiding place for a threat. The livery owner, a grizzled old man with a squint, gave them a long, appraising look. "Just passing through?" he asked, his voice low and suspicious. "Something like that," Fletcher replied, his voice equally guarded. George's gaze fell on a sign hanging crookedly over the saloon door, the Drifter's Last Chance Saloon. A wave of nausea washed over her. Her husband had been here, just before the bandits had taken them. She could feel the echoes of their presence, a ghostly trail in the dust and despair of the town. As they turned to head to the general store for supplies, a man stepped out of the saloon, a bottle in one hand, a sly, knowing smirk on his face. He was one of them. She knew it instantly. He looked at her with a chilling familiarity, his eyes lingering on her, a cruel glint in their depths. "Well, look what the wind blew in," he said, his voice a low sneer. "Thought you were dead." George's blood ran cold. He knew her. The hunters had found their prey. The words hung in the air, a chilling confirmation of their worst fears. Georgia froze, the blood draining from her face as she stared at the man. His name was Roy, one of Silas Blackwood's enforcers, a man with a reputation for brutality that preceded him. He had been there, on that dreadful day, his cruel smile a permanent fixture in her nightmares. Now, he stood before her, a living embodiment of the terror she was trying to escape. Fletcher, sensing the shift in the air, subtly moved between Georgia and the man, his hand casually resting on the butt of his pistol. His posture was relaxed, almost lazy, but his eyes were sharp, like a hawk's. Roy's smirk widened, revealing a set of stained teeth. "You got lucky, lady. But luck runs out in these parts." He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his gaze fixed on Fletcher. "Who's your friend? Don't reckon he knows who he's messing with." Fletcher didn't say a word, his silence a weapon as sharp as any blade. The tension in the street was a thick, suffocating blanket. The townsfolk, sensing the coming storm, began to scatter, their faces etched with a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. Georgia's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm. She wanted to run, to scream, but she knew that would only make things worse. She had to stand her ground. This was her fight. Just as Roy took another step, his hand inching towards his own weapon, Fletcher finally spoke, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Walk away, son. This ain't your business." Roy laughed, a short, ugly sound. "It is my business. This lady's family business is my business. And Blackwood wants to know where her husband is." The revelation hung in the air, a final piece of the puzzle falling into place. Her husband, who she had presumed dead, was still alive, and Blackwood wanted him. The stakes had just been raised. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the tense silence, the rapid beat of hooves on the road. A small party of riders, well-armed and dusty, rode into the street, their eyes fixed on the confrontation. And leading them, his face a mask of cold fury, was Silas Blackwood himself. The hunter had arrived. The game was over. The air in Salvation's Rest thickened, the quiet tension in the street exploding into a suffocating pressure. All eyes were on the new arrivals, a group of hard-faced men with an air of cold menace. But all eyes were on the man who led them. Silas Blackwood was a figure of polished cruelty, dressed in a black coat and a spotless white shirt, a sharp contrast to the dusty, worn landscape. His face was a chiseled mask of authority, but his eyes, a cold, calculating gray, held a terrifying emptiness. He dismounted with a fluid grace, his gaze sweeping over the scene until it landed on Georgia. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face, a viper finding its prey. "Well, well," he said, his voice as smooth and lethal as a drawn knife. "It seems the little bird flew right into my cage." Roy, emboldened by his master's presence, stepped forward, a triumphant smirk on his face. "Told you she wasn't dead, boss. Got herself a knight in dusty armor, too." Blackwood's gaze shifted to Fletcher, his eyes narrowing in appraisal. "And who might you be, friend?" he asked, his tone deceptively polite. Fletcher remained silent, his hand still on his pistol, his eyes meeting Blackwood's without a hint of fear. Georgia's heart was a frantic drum, a rhythm of pure terror. She knew Blackwood was not a man to be reasoned with. He was a force of nature, a hurricane of greed and violence that left nothing but destruction in its wake. He had taken her children, and now he was here for the last piece of the puzzle, her husband. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught Fletcher's eye. A second group of Blackwood's men, a larger party, was silently fanning out, blocking off the ends of the street. They were surrounded, trapped. Blackwood's smile never wavered as he savored their predicament. "You have two choices," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate growl. "You can tell me where your husband is, or you can watch me kill your friend here, and then I'll take you back anyway." A cold dread settled in Georgia's stomach. The choice was no choice at all. But as she opened her mouth to speak, a gunshot rang out from a nearby rooftop, the bullet striking the ground mere inches from Blackwood's feet. The street erupted into chaos. It was a sign, a warning shot from a hidden ally, a wild card in a game Blackwood thought he had already won. The sudden crack of the rifle shot shattered the tense tableau, and the street of Salvation's Rest erupted into a scene of chaotic pandemonium. Blackwood's men, caught off guard, scattered and took cover, their practiced discipline momentarily broken. Blackwood himself, his face a mask of furious shock, ducked behind a water trough, his polished veneer cracking under the pressure of the unexpected assault. Fletcher, seizing the moment, grabbed Georgia's arm and pulled her behind a horse-drawn wagon. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a sharp whisper. His eyes scanned the rooftops, trying to pinpoint the source of the shot. He saw a brief flash of a rifle barrel, a fleeting shadow, and then nothing. Their unknown savior was a ghost. Roy, his bravado replaced by a frantic fear, began shouting orders, trying to rally his men. But the damage was done. The element of surprise was gone. Fletcher knew this was their only chance. "When I say go, you run for the livery. Don't look back," he yelled over the rising din of shouts and panicked whinnies from the horses. He drew his pistol, his gaze fixed on the corner of the street where Blackwood was now barking orders. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and still surrounded, but they had a moment of confusion on their side. A moment bought for them by a nameless stranger. As Blackwood's men began to close in, Fletcher took a deep breath, his knuckles white around the grip of his pistol. "Now!" he yelled, and a single explosive shot rang out from his weapon, the bullet striking a lantern hanging above a store, causing it to shatter and ignite, casting the street in a sudden, blinding shower of sparks and light. Georgia didn't hesitate. She ran, her legs burning, her heart pounding, weaving through the chaos towards the livery. As she burst through the doors, she glanced back just in time to see Fletcher, a lone figure silhouetted against the fire, facing down Blackwood and his men, the unknown sniper, a fleeting memory. He was holding them off, buying her time, but for how long? A hail of gunfire erupted behind her, and she knew he was in a fight he couldn't possibly win. Georgia slammed the livery doors shut behind her, the heavy wood groaning in protest. The sound of the gunfight was a deafening roar, a symphony of violence that echoed off the walls. She fumbled with the latch, her hands shaking, and then heard the splintering sound of a boot kicking against the wood. They were right behind her. There was no time to think, no time to grieve. She had to move. She ran through the stables, a maze of stalls and shadows, her eyes darting frantically, searching for an escape. Bella, Fletcher's horse, neighed nervously, and Georgia, seeing a back door that led to an alley, knew what she had to do. She grabbed Bella's reins and with a surge of strength she didn't know she possessed, she led the mare out the back. As she burst into the alley, she heard a shout from the street behind her. "She's at the back. Get her!" Fear, cold and sharp, spurred her on. She mounted Bella, her hands clumsy, her heart a drumbeat of terror. She spurred the horse into a gallop, sending it thundering down the alley, the sounds of pursuit growing ever closer. She didn't know where she was going, she just knew she had to get away. The world was a blur of dust and fading light. She could only hope Fletcher was right behind her, that he had somehow survived the impossible odds. But as she rounded a corner and saw the open road ahead, she heard a new sound, a series of rapid gunshots, followed by a sudden, chilling silence. The gunfire had stopped, and Fletcher hadn't followed her. A new wave of dread washed over her, a terrible, gut-wrenching realization that he might not have made it. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. She was alone again, a solitary figure in a vast and unforgiving land, the weight of her promise, and a new one, to a man who had given his life for her, bearing down on her with crushing force. The game wasn't over, it had just taken a deadly turn. Thanks for watching part 1, please subscribe for more stories and drop your comments.